This slide is about Plato's ultimate theory of reality and knowledge. So we've got two sides to this diagram. On the right side, we've got different levels of reality. And as you can see here, this diagram is divided between appearance and reality. So things that are less real and more illusory, and things that are more real and more enduring. And then on the left side of the diagram, we've got this split between different levels of knowledge. We have got opinion at the lower level, and you can see this corresponds to appearances. And then you've got a more enduring and a more true kind of knowledge, which Plato simply calls knowledge. This corresponds to what he's going to call reality. Okay, so the big idea here is there's a divided line here, and it's between appearance and reality on the one hand and opinion and knowledge on the other. You can see at the top of this diagram, what we've got is a circle there. The circle there stands for the good or the sun. Okay, so let's start here at the lowest level of reality. At the lowest level of reality, Plato says, what we have are shadows. And shadows are just a poetic way of talking about images of physical things. So, for example, you're looking at shadows on your computer screen. And the idea here is there's a physical room here in my apartment. My body, another physical thing, is in this room, and I'm projecting images of these physical things up onto the web. And Plato would say what corresponds to these shadows are a certain kind of opinion. He calls them conjectures. The name for the kinds of knowledge are not as important as what the knowledge corresponds to. So I wouldn't try memorizing these names or anything like that. You really won't need to. But the idea is this. You have conjectures about these shadows. And when you make accurate guesses about what those shadows are going to do, then you have accurate conjectures. So, for example, if you think my image is going to start on this side of the screen and it's going to move this way, and that's your conjecture, and in fact, my image does do what you thought it would do, then you've made an accurate conjecture. If you thought on the contrary that it was going to go that way, then your conjecture was incorrect. So the important point is opinions can be more or less wrong, according to Plato. It's not all opinions are equally good, and there's no way of saying there are more and less accurate conjectures. Okay, the next level up is the level of the physical objects themselves. So that would include things like everything you see here in this room. That would include things like our bodies themselves. This would include, going back to Monday's lecture, it would include the tree that the eye was looking at, and the sun in the physical world. Those are all physical objects. And once again, don't worry too much about why this is called conviction. But what Plato basically is trying to say is we have convictions or beliefs about those material objects. He still considers this a kind of opinion, and he still thinks that you can have more or less accurate convictions about physical things themselves. So you can make, for example, predictions about physical objects. I know that if I drop this pointer, it will fall into my hand. I've made, I have accurate convictions about the physical qualities of this this pointer, and so forth. Okay, and so convictions, like conjectures, admit of higher and lower degrees of accuracy or validity. The really important stuff, the really important realities Plato would say, happen above this blue line you see cutting our diagram in half. The first level of reality that Plato is going to claim is extremely important for a philosopher to access is the level of mathematics. We'll talk a little bit more about mathematics today as we're talking about the training for the ruler guardians. But the important thing about mathematics is it corresponds to a true level of knowledge. So for the first time, Plato is going to dignify the things going on in our heads that correspond to a certain kind of reality with the name of knowledge. And once again, the names are not that important, but what Plato calls it is thoughtfulness. He says a thoughtful person is the kind of person who's able to, as it were, get behind the physical objects into the mathematical realities of those objects. So, for example, a thoughtful person is not only going to understand, oh, I'm looking at a triangle-shaped object in the world. A thoughtful person, Plato would say, is going to understand that the definition or the form or the idea of a triangle is roughly a 2D figure with 3 sides and 3 angles. That's the idea of a triangle. Remember, we were talking about Plato's theories of ideas, and ideas have a shape. The shape of them is their definition, and I just basically defined a triangle. And you can do all sorts of nifty things with these definitions. So, for example, you can take hypotheses in a science like geometry and use these hypotheses to reason your way to a geometric conclusion. And I'm just going to show you one page from an ancient book of geometry. This is called Euclid's Elements. And you can see here how these geometric proofs work. Proposition 32. I'm actually going to simplify this. So you've got the full thing there. Don't worry about it. I'm going to simplify it. Here's the proposition 32 in simplified form. In any triangle, the sum of the 3 interior angles equals 2 right angles. So what do we notice here? Euclid is saying, if there is a triangle, the sum of the inside angles is going to equal 180 degrees. And Euclid is then going to prove that if you draw a triangle ABC, the angles ABC, BCA, CAB all add up to 2 right angles. Okay. What do you notice about this example of geometric proof? You've got to just start with a hypothesis. And the hypothesis is, if there is a triangle ABC, once you've posited or hypothesized that there is a triangle ABC, all sorts of things can be proved about it. All sorts of conclusions would follow. Okay, that's how math works, according to Plato, at least. Philosophy works a little different. So philosophy is able to access this highest level of reality. So if you're accessing mathematical ideas with your thoughtfulness, you're accessing ethical ideas with your intelligence. Ethical ideas, just to review, are things like justice is defined as each part doing the job it's best naturally suited for. And the difference between math and philosophy here is that Plato is saying, if there is justice, then justice in the city looks this way. If there is justice, then justice in the soul looks this way. But philosophy wants to go further than this hypothetical reasoning. Philosophy according to Plato, Socrates has to come to the first principles. And this is why I've got this sun figure up there next to the ethical forms. Because the idea is philosophy is not satisfied with saying, if justice were real. Philosophy wants to say justice is real, and here's why. And as we remember from the simile of the sun, the reason that justice exists, as well as the reason that we can see justice, why justice is intelligible, is that there's something called the good, which is the ultimate reality. And so philosophy has to come to this first principle. You could call it a starting assumption if you wanted, or you could call it a sort of foundational principle. And it's the job of intelligence to reason our way, not from a hypothesis down to a conclusion, but rather from a hypothesis upwards to the first principle. In this case, the good. Okay, so I know this is complex. Plato knows it's complex, which is why Plato is also going to take this entire diagram and he's going to represent it in an easier to digest form. And that is in the allegory of the cave. Allegory just means story or fable. Usually this story, like a fable, has got a moral. And we'll talk about the moral of the allegory of the cave. It's a political moral. It's a political story. Okay, the second thing I want to do is talk about dialogue as philosophical expertise. If you're thinking about the allegory of the cave, if you've done your reading, dialogue, philosophical dialogue is what gets you out of the cave and what you're supposed to bring back into the cave. Okay, and I'll talk about that in the second half of the lecture. I'm going to try playing a video. This video, I think, is going to work because we tested it a little bit before class started. So it's a short video, and it captures, I would say, most of Socrates' philosophical claims about reality and knowledge. It puts that diagram that we were just looking at with the 4 levels of reality and the 4 levels of knowledge into an easier to understand story. Okay, so here we go.
Imagine prisoners that have spent their entire lives chained deep inside a cave. They have been chained so that they cannot see behind themselves. They are forced to stare endlessly at the cave wall in front of them. Behind them, a fire is burning, and between the prisoners and the fire is a raised walkway. Now imagine that each day a menagerie of objects crosses the walkway. Animals, people carrying their wares to market. Their shapes create an intricate shadow play on the wall in front of the prisoners. This is the only world that the prisoners have ever known. The shadows and the echoes of unseen objects. Now, imagine that the prisoner is released. After some time adjusting to the blinding light, the freed prisoner will begin to experience the world outside of the cave for the very first time. And it is like nothing he could have ever imagined. With this new perception of the world, the man will of course want to return to his friends to share his incredible discoveries. But the prisoners cannot recognize their old friend. He appears as all things do. His voice is a distorted echo, and his body is hides a grotesque shadow. They cannot understand his fantastic stories of the world outside of the cave. To them, it will never exist. This, of course, does not make the world outside of the cave any less real.
So this is Plato's allegory of the cave. It is one of the most famous allegories in all of European philosophy. People return to it again and again. It is also the inspiration for movies like the Matrix trilogy. I don't know if you guys have seen that. It's a little more my time than your time. And it's also the question being dealt with by contemporary philosophers when they ask things like, how do we know that we're not living in this big computer simulation? How do we know that what we experience as offline reality, never mind the stuff online, the offline reality isn't some video game in another more real universe? If you're interested in that, that's the simulation thought experiment, and a guy named Nick Bostrom, Bostrom, has written papers on this. Excuse me. And people like Elon Musk have popularized it. Sorry. So the big question for Socrates' allegory of the cave is, what is truly real? And as you can tell, the point is, outside the cave is truly real. Inside the cave is less real. And how does Socrates basically line up the elements in the story with the levels of that previous diagram? Well, inside the cave, you've got two kinds of things. You've got images of things, and you've got material things. The images of things, what Plato calls shadows, are projected onto the wall. And those are like the images that we see on movie screens and images that we see on our laptops and computer screens. Then you've got material things, which in the story are coded as cutouts on sticks. You remember the people walking around with the cutout of the rabbit or the cutout of the rock or whatever. Okay. And those are the physical things in our world, the things we assume by looking at the images on your screen that, you know, there's actually a toaster and a microwave over in the background there. Okay, so those would be the cutouts on the sticks. Getting above this divided line, there are two different kinds of things. There are mathematical ideas, which are represented in the allegory of the cave as the natural objects outside the cave. So in Plato's original story, there aren't actually people out there, and that's an important point. What Plato was saying is the realm of ideas, the reality of ideas, there's not people out there, although people can access it. We're not looking at people, we're looking at ideas. Okay, so that's where the video, that's where Plato would pick at that video a little bit. But all the trees and all the paths, all the rocks and so forth, those natural objects represent mathematical ideas. Then there's a level that the video didn't really talk about, but which is in Plato's original story. He says eventually the philosopher would start looking up into the skies and look at the heavenly bodies. And those represent ethical ideals. Those represent things like truth, beauty, justice, and so on. Okay, and eventually, Plato says, the escaped prisoner will be able to look and see the sun. Maybe not look directly at the sun. As we were saying, it's hard to directly define the good. It's hard to, strictly speaking, know the good, but you can catch a glimpse of the sun if you turn your body towards it and if you lift your gaze, as it were. And that, of course, stands for the good. And so Plato here is referencing that simile of the sun, where the good is like the sun. Okay. Here's what I think the video is really missing. And this, I think, has to do with the contemporary reception of the allegory of the cave. You'll notice there was not a word in that video about politics, and not a word in that video about how the government is set up, and not a word about that in that video about how the entire society would be put together. But the entire point of the allegory of the cave, and the whole reason that it's in this book, Plato's Republic, a work of political theory, is that Socrates' claim is that only the philosopher has gotten outside of the cave, and only the philosopher can bring what is outside of the cave back into the cave itself. So the whole crux of the moral of this story is that the philosopher is suited to rule because he has a higher kind of knowledge, a knowledge based on a higher kind of reality. So that's the political moral. Then Socrates is going to talk about two cases, because what the philosopher should do depends on what is back inside that cave. So, what if the inside of that cave is a unjust society? In that case, Socrates thinks, the philosopher's return into the cave is doing a goodness beyond duty. The philosopher is not obligated to go back into the cave because, and you know this if you did today's reading, if you go back into the cave, you have a very hard time communicating. Remember in the video, the philosopher's voice was muffled. It was wah, 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 wah. Nobody could understand what he was saying. And if you noticed in the reading, they said the people inside the cave would not really welcome the philosopher's knowledge. Why? Because their entire world is inside the cave. Why? Because they think all that reality is not even the cutouts behind them, but the shadows in front of them. Okay, and so all this highfalutin talk about, hey, there's actually trees and rivers and stars and planets outside the cave. Let me tell you about them. They're not going to welcome that news. They're going to get really annoyed with him. They're going to think he's lost his rationality. They're going to think he's making stuff up. They're going to think, ironically, that the philosopher is the delusional one. Okay, so in this case, the philosopher has somehow emancipated themselves, has taken the shackles off of themselves, probably through, most literally, talking with themselves. Because the idea is this is an unjust city. There's really nobody else to have these Socratic Q&As about. And the philosopher would basically start questioning themselves and come to philosophical knowledge. Okay. It's a different case. It's the opposite case in a just city. In the just city, the philosopher has a duty to come back into the cave and help liberate the other cave dwellers. So this is not the sort of do-it-yourself case of the unjust city. This is the case of an entire society which is oriented towards the good and which is dedicated to helping everyone inside the cave get to the highest levels of reality, to access the highest levels of reality, and to attain the highest levels of knowledge that they're possible, that they're capable of. So in this case, Socrates says, it doesn't matter if the philosopher really greatly prefers life outside the cave. Because you can imagine the true calling of the philosopher is to live outside of the cave. The true calling of the philosopher is to basically inhabit the higher reality of the realm of ideas. And if we're talking about the cave metaphor, it's like saying, I don't really like being in that smelly, dank, dark cave. There's hardly any light. I can barely see anything. People misunderstand me. I'd rather be outside free, frolicking in the forests and swimming in the rivers and so forth. Okay, in this case, Socrates says, we've got to set these philosophers straight. We've got to make them realize that they owe their existence to this just city. And here's what Socrates suggests saying to them. Look, it's one thing if your city were actually unjust. It's another thing if you grew up in our city, which is just. In your case, and this is on page 246, leading into page 247, paragraph markings on the side there. In your case, it's we who gave birth to you, both for your benefit and for that of others. Important point here, Socrates thinks that when you play the part you're best suited for, it's for your own good and it helps the overall city as a whole. This is another way of saying when each individual pursues their excellence, the overall excellence of the city also flourishes. It's we who gave birth to you both for your own benefit and for that of others, as leaders and kings, as it were in the hive. Here, Plato is actually comparing the city-state to a beehive, or maybe an ant mound, or something like that. So there's definitely a sense of collectivity going on here. You are better and more completely educated than the rest, and more capable than they are of sharing in both kinds of life. You've got the privilege of being able to experience both the world of ideas and the material world. And how do you have that privilege? It's because the city educated you. And because, yes, you excelled in the educational system of the just city. So down, each of you must go in turn. All the philosophers have got to basically stop philosophizing a little bit and start doing political things. To share their living space, to live in the material world, and become accustomed like them to observing things in the dark. Because as you become used to it, having yourselves seen the truth about beautiful and just and good things, you'll see 1,000 times better than they do what each kind of shadowy image is and what it is an image of. It's because you philosophers have true knowledge of ideas and true knowledge of the forms. I've just said the same thing twice. That because you know how things like beauty and justice and good are actually defined. Your sight in the cave is going to be, he says, 1,000 times better than theirs. And you have to help your fellow cave dwellers, because remember, the philosopher went back in the cave. He didn't just permanently escape. You have to help those fellow cave dwellers see the light. In other words, see the good. Okay, so the philosopher's duty in either case is to serve justice. So you remember, justice is this idea of doing what you're best suited for. However, justice has to be modified based on circumstance. You can't just willy-nilly apply justice because the definition of justice is extremely abstract. Sometimes Plato says it basically means doing your job and minding your own business, not trying to interfere with other people's jobs, doing your job, the job you're best suited for. Okay, so if your job is to serve justice in an unjust city, and really the city is too far gone along the path of corruption, and really the city is just decaying in a moral sense, and really the city is unsalvageable. You can't salvage it. You can't save this city. And if you went back into the cave and you started trying to teach and started trying to say, hey, do you know that what you think is reality is actually a bunch of shadows on the walls and other illusions? If those people would get really mad at you and try and kill you or try and silence you and try and exile you, you have no obligation. Socrates is saying you have no obligation to try and teach them. In that case, you work on yourself. Maybe you talk to a philosopher friend or two, form a small study group or a study circle or a small school, really, and that's how you serve justice. Okay, that's doing your job in an unjust city. In a just city, however, the case is completely the opposite. In a just city, the city actually already has the proper allocation, the proper distribution of roles. And that means your job in a just city is to preserve the proper allocation of roles. It's to do your job and to teach other people about the ethical ideas, including the idea of justice, which your city is keeping alive and sustaining. So in this scenario, the just city is the thing to be preserved, and that's where justice can be attained. In the other scenario of the unjust city, the city is hopeless, and you've got to preserve justice at the level of individual. Okay, sorry, there's one more thing I needed to say, and I glossed over it because I was in a rush to get to that second slide. So let's return to the allegory of the cave. There are two ways that the philosopher runs into trouble seeing. Socrates says, when the philosopher first leaves the cave, they get blinded by the light of the sun. Why? Because in the cave, there's just this dim fire at the back of the cave. Out in reality, the material, out in, outside the cave, there's a sun, there's a full-blown sun. So they're blinded by the light, and their eyes have got to get used to things before they can really even start making out the trees and the rivers and the grass around them. And only gradually, through some training of their eyes and some adjustment to the light, will the philosopher be able to look up at the stars and look up at the planets and look up near the sun. There's the inverse case of blinding, when you get blinded by the darkness. And this is the trouble that the philosopher has readjusting to the cave after their eyes have already adjusted to the real world. It's going to be hard to see when you first get back into the cave, just like it's going to be hard to speak to your fellow cave dwellers in their ordinary language once you've really become skilled and expert in mathematical ideas and ethical ideas, in other words, philosophy. And this is a difficulty that the philosopher is going to have communicating with non-philosophers. That difficult will be highest in a corrupted city, an unjust city, and the difficult will still be there, Socrates is saying, in the just city. There's always going to be some difficulty translating philosophy back into ordinary language. And if you want to look at this from a meta perspective, that's exactly why Plato keeps telling stories. The myth of the metals, the allegory of the cave, the simile of the sun, the ship of the state, and so forth. That's Plato modeling for us. How do you translate these philosophical ideas into basically morality tales and fables? Okay, so that's the last thing I want to say about the allegory of the cave. You get blinded when you cross the threshold of the cave. You get blinded either way. Dialogue in ancient Greek is called dialectic, and you'll see most translations, including this Christopher Rowe one we're using, use this term. The easiest way to think about this is dialectic just means dialogue. There are more technical uses that come in later philosophers who are building off of this ancient Greek base, but it's just a Greek word for a thing we know very well, which is just going back and forth with partners in conversation. So the journey outside of the cave is a metaphor for Socratic dialogue. And as I was saying, You can have a Socratic dialogue with yourself. That's the kind of the philosopher in solitude thinking about stuff. Or you can have it with others, and that would be the case of a philosopher receiving a philosophical education from those philosophers who have come before him or her. Dialectic or dialogue is simply the Q&A method. The important point is the capacity or faculty of the soul being used in Socratic dialogue is reason. It's your reason. And the reason of your soul is very different from the shape of your body. And the reason of your soul, yes, it is embodied. And yes, it has to be harmonized with the rest of your body. It has to be harmonized with the spirited part, your kind of passionate part, your competitive part, which is closer to your body. And your reason has to be harmonized with your appetites, your wants and desires. Reason has to help educate those wants and desires and restrain those wants and desires. But your reason itself does not depend upon what form your body takes. And this, for example, is why Socrates thinks that it doesn't matter if you have a masculine body, a man's body, or a feminine body, a woman's body, when it comes to selecting guardians. So reason is basically the same in everybody, no matter what you look like, where you come from, and so forth. This is why Socrates says you basically can't do ad hominem attacks. Ad hominem are basically personal attacks. You cannot argue based on the person. Sometimes your body shows us that your reason is not in charge. That was the case of Thrasymachus acting crazy and needing other people to hold him back. But Thrasymachus's reason is just as reasonable and as disembodied, non-physical as Socrates. Okay, so where are we now? Philosophical dialogue is both dangerous and beneficial, and I'll cover these points pretty quickly. It's dangerous because Socrates thinks that immature people simply take the skeptical side of the Q&A, and they don't respect the results of the Q&A, which are true ideas. So Socrates says, couldn't you imagine young, rebellious teenage men using the Socratic Q&A, perhaps if they were encouraged by a Thrasymachus type, to basically undermine the idea of morality itself, to say that all morality is just convention, to say that all ethics are just made up and time and place specific, and so forth. So that's the danger of the dialectic. The benefit of the dialectic, though, outweighs the potential dangers. The idea is philosopher kings will use dialogue in the capacity of kingship. And I can imagine them doing this in two ways. The first is the philosopher will lead by example. And so the idea is if the philosopher conducts these debates or dialogues out in public where others can see them and where you can really see the difference between a Socrates type and his polar opposite, the Thrasymachus type, and you can see the difference between the Socrates type and the Glaucon and Adeimantus, the helper type, that will, as it were, inspire people to be like Socrates, to try and come as close to the Socratic ideal as they can. The other thing that these public dialogues would be able to do is help people see the truth. And so if there's a skeptical side to the Socratic Q&A, there's also a kind of dogmatic side. And the idea is the Q&A is what gives us confidence that the conclusions we arrive to are actually true. Why? Because they've been tested. Why? Because they've been subject to skeptical objections. Why? Because everybody using their reason is able to reason from common premises to common conclusions. And this is why it's so important for Socrates to continually check in with his audience and say, would you agree, Glaucon? Would you agree, Adeimantus? Would you agree, Polemarchus? Would you agree, Thrasymachus, even? Okay, so there are two sides to the dialectic. There's the skeptical side and the dogmatic side. There's the truth questioning side and also the truth discovering side. And this roughly corresponds to the dangerous and the beneficial sides of the dialectic.